What's up, guys? Mark here at Metal Vibes, and today we are going to be talking about the Polish blackened death metal band Azarath. We're going to be ranking their discography, and so for a bit of background on Azarath, they're probably best known as being Inferno's other band, Inferno being the drummer from Behemoth. But they've established quite a career for themselves in their own right, with 7 albums so far. They formed in 1998 and were formed by Inferno and members of the Polish death metal band Damnation, and would release their debut album Demon Seed in 2001. So let's go ahead and start talking about that. So the Demon Seed album kind of reminds me of, I guess, if Behemoth's Satanica album was just made as raw as possible. There's a really unpolished production on this that really emphasizes the drums. That snare in particular sounds super rattly, and when Inferno just lets loose on his blast beats, as he's apt to do, it just rattles your skeleton, which I just love. The songwriting, likewise, is very unruly, very chaotic, a lot of pinch harmonics and just riffs that sound like they're stabbing in every which direction, super violent sounding. And the songwriting itself, in terms of the song structures, it just feels like a total onslaught. Right from the start with Earthly Morgue, it just feels like riff after riff is getting piled on the listener, with the songs kind of just doing whatever they want, not necessarily a whole lot of hooks here. But I kind of like that. It's a pretty savage album. The performances are savage. Bruno, the vocalist, uses some guttural, bestial vocals with some rasps thrown in there for good measure. Mind Loss is a cool track, which adds a little bit of variety with an eerie, atmospheric riff. Although I will say overall, not a hugely varied album. One smart move they do on this album is using an interlude. Tidium Vitae is an interlude that uses classical music combined with what sounds like a guy pleasuring himself. I'm not sure what it's supposed to be, but either way, having a little break from the blasting in the middle of the album definitely works. This isn't an album with a whole lot of standouts, but its energy and rawness is really endearing, and I definitely enjoy it quite a bit. I'll probably put it right in the middle of their discography for now, and we'll see how it shakes out at the end. All right, so in 2003, the band would follow up Demon Seed with Infernal Blasting. This album feels pretty similar to the last one. You still maintain that raw production. The drum sound on this album is maybe a little bit less prominent, but I feel like Inferno makes up for that with just an absolutely insane performance. Listening to the blast beats on the opening track, Legacy of Tyrant Goat, is just makes it sound like Inferno is inhuman. That song also kind of highlights how there is a little bit of a shift on this album into what I feel like is a little bit more of a coherent songwriting direction. The songs in general tend to be slightly more memorable. The riffing tends to be a little bit less chaotic and easier to follow, at least to my ears. Still very blunt and punishing, but I tend to remember the songs on this album a little bit more. Nuclear Revelation in particular has some dramatic chords in the chorus that I really like. Christ Scum has a really cool chorus with the band just chanting Christ fucking scum. Really gets me, and apparently is something they play live fairly frequently. Infested with Sin mixes it up in the second half of the album with some pounding slower riffs. Although I will say overall, this listen for some reason feels a little bit more exhausting than Demon Seed, even though this has actually less music on it. The last 3 minutes of this album is silence, leaving only 26 and a half minutes of music on the album, which feels like borderline EP length to me. The final 2 tracks, and particularly the closing track, Born to Rot, don't really do a whole lot for me. So while this album is definitely an improvement in some respects, stylistically, I actually like it a little bit more than Demon Seed, but it just doesn't come together quite as well for me, and with those quibbles that I do have, I think I just have to put it a little bit below Demon Seed overall. So that brings us to 2006 with Diabolic Impious Evil. Now, I feel like every band has that one album in their discography that is their signature album. It's that one album that just captures the band's identity, and for Azarath, I feel like that's Diabolic Impious Evil. A lot came together here just to make it feel like Azarath's signature album. The performances are probably better than ever. Inferno's drumming especially is just absolutely abusive, which it kind of reminds me of Alex Hernandez's performance on Immolation's Close to a World Below album. Production-wise, it's still pretty raw, but things are more balanced. The guitars are more powerful. The songwriting is a little bit more memorable and dynamic, even than the previous album. Opening track Whip the Whore opens with some atmospheric clean picking before unleashing a barrage of riffs upon the eardrums. Likewise, Baptized in the Sperm of the Antichrist and Forsake My Blood have some of the catchiest choruses in the band's discography. Forsake My Blood is actually a live staple, apparently, and a lot of songs from this album are played by the band live pretty frequently based on the setlist.fm statistics that I saw. Screamin' Legions Death Metal is another great track with a marching rhythm that occurs partway through and then near the end. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Behemoth's Zoskia Kultus album. Again, I do have some quibbles with this album, though. The closing track, Goat Horn's Revenge, is not the greatest, but I do like how it ends with the same cleanly picked motif that opens the album. There's a couple tracks I don't care for as much, but yeah, overall, I really enjoy this record. I wouldn't quite say it's my favorite, but it's definitely what I would recommend for new listeners who have never heard the band before, so I'll put it near the top, but not quite at the very top. Okay, and that brings us to 2009 with Praise the Beast. So this was the band's first album for Agodia Records, and this album felt like a bit of a step forward into a slightly more accessible sound. The production here is a little bit more polished. The songwriting shifts a bit from the uncompromising approach of the first three albums into something that's a bit more palatable. The band also used some embellishments on this album, particularly the layered vocals in I Hate Your Kind on the title track, which kind of remind me of Deicide in the way they layer the raspier, higher register vocals with the more guttural vocals. There's also some gang vocals at the end of the track Sacrifice of Blood, which I really like. Invocation is another great song, which mixes squealing guitars and then some whispered vocals during the refrain. It makes things feel sinister, but still heavy. This is also a longer album overall at 42 minutes, and the songs in general are longer here. I don't know if that always works. The song Queen of the Sabbath tries to mix things up with a little bit of a slower approach, and it's a fine song, but I think it lasts a little bit too long. There's also a string of tracks in the second half of the album that, while they're all pretty good, none of them really stand out too much. Obey the Flesh being just one example. The closing instrumental From Beyond the Coldest Star is pretty cool, but I feel like the album's missing just some epic track in the second half just to really bring it all together. This album seems to be less highly regarded overall. Even the band don't seem to love this album too much. Based on the setlist.fm stats that I saw, it seems like the band don't play songs from this album live very often. That said, I do have kind of a soft spot for it. This was the first Azarath album that I heard, so I really personally enjoy it. I think it's a good transition for the band into something a little bit more accessible without sacrificing the band's identity. So I actually do enjoy it more than the first two albums, so I'll put it just below Diabolic Impious Evil. Alright, so that brings us to 2011 with the album Blasphemers Maledictions. Now, this was a big step forward for the band, and as you can see, the band shifted away from a black and white cover art into a color painting, which I think kind of signified that the band was moving on into bigger and better things, if you will. Before this album was released, Nurgle, the frontman of Behemoth, was diagnosed with leukemia, so Behemoth went inactive because of that, and Inferno apparently had more time to compose for this album. The label also apparently gave them more time in the studio to work on this album, and you could definitely hear a lot of care went into this album. The production is a lot more polished, it still hits hard, there's still a lot of force, and the songs in general feel more developed with more ideas and more variety. There was also some new blood introduced on this album. The only two members that remained from the previous album were Inferno and the guitarist Bart. They got a new vocalist for this album, Necrosodom, who, unlike Bruno, uses a bit more of a gargly rasp, which is a fine approach, but I kind of do prefer the approach of Bruno on the first four albums. Songwriting-wise, though, there are some excellent tracks here, particularly the first proper track, Supreme Reign of Tiamat, which has this awesome ascending tremolo line during the chorus, and then near the end of the track, there's a little bit of a pause and then just a stomping groove that just gets me every time. It's probably my favorite moment in the band's discography. Fire Breath of Blasphemy and Scorn is just a blasting onslaught, and then Behold the Satan Sword has a main riff that sounds something like Melichesh with a little bit of an Eastern-flavored tremolo going on. Under the Will of the Lord's an interesting track, using some acoustic guitars and then pained shouts that make it sound like a depressive black metal album. Overall, this is a really fun album. It definitely takes things to the next level. You can tell the band were really keen on becoming a blackened death metal powerhouse, and I think they largely succeeded. It suffers a bit from first track syndrome because I love Supreme Reign of Tiamat so much that everything else is a bit overshadowed by that. But nonetheless, when I was re-listening to the discography, I just couldn't help but feel everything here just felt like it was taken to the next level. Even with my quibbles, I have to say this belongs at the top. The best Azarath album, not necessarily the one I would recommend for first time listeners, but certainly the crowning achievement in their discography. All right, next was In Extremis, which came out in 2017. So, despite the fact that there was a 6-year gap between this album and Blasphemous Malediction, there actually weren't any lineup changes during that time, and it doesn't sound like there was a lot of inner band turmoil either. It sounds like the band were just taking their time, writing riffs, and producing the best album they could. A lot of times, taking time off to perfect an album can result in some pretty good material. Here, it almost feels to me like the band just lost their groove a little bit. This isn't necessarily a generic album, but it just doesn't quite engage me the same way their previous albums do. And I think a lot of critics seem to agree with me. I remember when this album came out, it just seemed like the reception was a little bit lukewarm. That being said, there were some things I found that I liked a lot, especially on re-listen. While the production remains pretty clean, the rattly snare sound from the Demon Seed album is back, which I really like. Necrosodom uses a bit more of a guttural approach here, which I prefer to his gurgly rasp. And there's a couple of cool songs to be found too. Annihilation in particular has some lively riffs, making it probably my favorite song here. The Slain God is an interesting track with some marching military rhythms and symphonic sounding effects. At the Gates of Understanding, despite having a song title that sounds like it's from a Fields of the Nephilim album, uses this supercharged thrash riff to really get you going. Overall, this is regarded as one of their less impressive albums, and I'd have to agree, but I definitely think it's still enjoyable. All their albums are great. All their albums are worth listening to. And this album made me realize just how tough it is to rank their discography. Diabolic Impious Evil and Blasphemous Maledictions are easily my top 2 Azarath albums, but below that, it's just a matter of degrees. Really, the amount I like this one compared to Praise the Beast or the first 2 albums is very slight. I will put it at the bottom because I think I prefer those 3 albums more, but again, very slight difference between them in terms of quality. All right, and that brings us to their final album, 2020's Saint Desecration. With this album, the band would once again change vocalists. They got a guy named Skull Ripper from the Polish death metal band Embryonal. His rasp has a little bit more bite to it. It almost sounds more like a black metal approach, which is cool, but again, I think Bruno's performance on the first 4 albums is still my favorite. Stylistically, this is a really intense album. The production makes the drums sound like you're just getting pummeled by hail, which is great. In terms of riffing, there's a lot of frantic intervals here that make it sound like Decade of Therion just put on steroids and given cocaine. Yeah. That said, there's still some interesting moments to mix things up and add some dynamics. The opening track, Death at Will, breaks partway through for this cleanly picked interlude that makes the song sound pretty intriguing, and it makes the blasting parts around that interlude feel even more intense. Sancta de Meretrix, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, has some whiplashing intervals, really catchy riffs, personal favorite of mine. Life is Death, Death is Life uses a demented riff that lurches forward and almost reminds me a bit of Deicide. And then closer, Beyond the Gates of Burning Gat uses some layered clean picking. There's a lot of reverb in the guitars. And actually there's a lot of clean picking throughout this album, which I think is cool and adds a nice bit of atmosphere. The riffs and songs here aren't always the catchiest, but the album as a whole feels angrier and just a little bit more inspired than In Extremis. It feels like the band spent a little bit more time with this one. I personally have spent less time with this album than the other ones because it is their newest, so it is hard to rank it. If I had to put it somewhere, which I do, I would probably put it just above Demon Seed, right in the middle of their discography. And time will tell whether my opinion on that changes, but I think that's what I'll leave it at for now. So yeah, that's my Azarath ranking, but let me know what you think of their albums in the comments. Let me know how you would rank them, and tune in next time for more. Stay heavy.